There is an opinion that history is ruled by certain laws, which are historical regularities elevated to the absolute, and it is these laws that govern the movements of historical processes. This opinion is opposed by those who believe that history is ruled by his majesty of chance. The truth, as usual, somewhere in the middle and derived by historians in later times, regularities are sometimes strictly connected with a set of accidents that allowed them to be realized. The history of civil wars in Rome is an excellent example. There are a carload of bifurcation points and a small cart, and we will consider one of them today. What if Mark Antony had won the Battle of Cape Actium and the civil war with Octavian? Starting military action against Octavian, Mark Antony was confident of his own victory, and he had many reasons for this. First, thanks to the support of Eastern allied kings, he had a much larger army than Octavian's, not much inferior in quality. Secondly, the economic base of the eastern provinces was much more powerful, and by controlling Egypt and grain supplies from it, Mark Antony held Italy, which was always in need of grain, by the throat. Third, Mark Antony was still the people's favorite. Charismatic people's tribune won the hearts of ordinary Romans even during the heated conflict between Caesar and the Senate, and after the Ides of March he became the face of the Caesarians. The plebs loved Mark Antony even when he was an enemy of the Republic, even after Octavian had announced a massive campaign of vilification of his fellow triumvir during the food crisis. It is indicative that at the moment when Mark Antony actually blackmailed Octavian that either he would fulfill his demands and receive grain, or he would not, and would condemn Rome to famine, a significant part of the plebs considered Octavian to be the culprit of the situation. The Senate, seeing that the plebs on the side of Antony, was forced to cling even tighter to Octavian, fearing that Antony's victory could shift the balance in the Republic. Plebs saw in Antony still the same defender of the interests of the common people, and even propaganda that he betrayed Rome, became a puppet of barbarian kings, and wants to revive the royal power, could not completely change the sympathy of the people. In this regard, Octavian's position could deteriorate sharply if he was defeated in Greece. It is not so difficult to imagine. The Battle of Cape Actium was not meant to be decisive in the war at all, more like a prelude battle before the main stage of the war, the land campaign. It is believed that the turning point of it was the flight of the fleet of Queen Cleopatra, not even entered into battle, and the subsequent escape of Antony. If the fleet of the Queen of Egypt still took part in the battle, and Antony continued to lead the battle, he had every chance to push back the fleet of Octavian and begin to transport troops. Agrippa, who commanded Octavian's legions, was undoubtedly a talented commander, but it is unlikely that he would have been able to cope with 1.5 times the size of Antony's army, while Antony himself was hardly less talented. Defeat in Greece could have led to Octavian's loss of popularity, the flight of a number of senators to Antony, unrest in Rome, and even the betrayal of some of the legions. Not having a strong charisma, relying on intrigue, money, and influence, Octavian, in such a development of events, could only hope for a sudden stupor Antony, but after the victory in Greece, such a development was unlikely. Much more logical would be the landing of Antony in Brundisium and parallel offensive part of the legions from the north through Illyria in Italy. Under the circumstances, the Senate, already tired of constant wars, would have staged a small palace coup and would have given Octavian, or his corpse, to Antony in exchange for avoiding reprisals. That's it. The war was over. It was time to build a new world. The reason why the senators would go to such negotiations, and Antony would agree to their proposal, is actually prosaic. The Senate of that time is no longer the Senate of the times of Cicero and Cato. Its numbers are so reduced that after the war, Octavian will cut the number of senators in half and still have to recruit riders to it. There was no good reason not to obey the one who had in his hands the largest army in the Republic. So better a bad peace than perpetual war. Antony also needed the senators alive because he still needed to govern the state, and it was impossible to do it without a pool of experienced cadres. Yes, Antony and the senators would have to hold more than one round of negotiations over the new contours of power, But the paradox is that Antony's victory would lead to the establishment of a much more republican regime than under Octavian. Octavian had already established complete control over the Senate, gentle but insistent. The Senate was completely loyal to him, with no significant leverage over the main institution of the Republic at the time, the army. For Octavian, winning the war was the last step towards establishing his sole power. But Antony would have to rebuild relations with the not very benevolent Senate. We can assume that in general the system of power under Antony would have resembled the hypothetical Pompey's Principate. The princeps Antony would have the highest military empire, controlling the army, would also have a decisive voice during the discussions in the Senate, but the Senate would have been left in the hands of finance and legislation. Antony could have taken a dictatorship following Caesar's example, but he would hardly have done so, as dictatorship did not help Caesar in any way to retain power. The way out could be in the annual re-election to the consulship. On the one hand, it would be an annual confirmation of the loyalty of the Senate. On the other hand, a sign of trust on the part of Antony would be the permission to hold the second consular post to someone from the senators. In this case, the position of princeps, coupled with the powers of tribune, which Antony would certainly have received in the commissions from a grateful people, would have allowed him to have a decisive voice in disputes with his second consular colleague. Thus, although having in his hands the instrument of coercion in the form of legions, Antony would have to reach a compromise with the Senate every year. This situation may seem to favor the Senate exclusively, but it would hardly have been a problem. Because, first, Antony could use his popularity with the people to pass laws through the comitia, rather than blackmail the Senate if it became stroppy. Secondly, having such an ulta in hand, it was possible to negotiate with the Senate not to use it in exchange for a more loyal attitude to certain bills. Thirdly, Antony, like Octavian in reality, would have to deal with the issue of restoring the number of the Senate, where he could introduce a significant part of his associates from the non-Senate class. And here an interesting question arises. It is worth remembering that a significant role in the victory of Antony played military contingents of allied Eastern rulers. They went to war having some agreements with Antony about dividends from the victory. It was definitely about gaining more autonomy within the Republic, but not independence, of course. On the other hand, after the victory, these rulers could demand to be included in the Senate in order to further defend their interests. Naturally, the patrician families of Rome would oppose this, as they had previously opposed Caesar's inclusion of the Gallic nobility in the ranks of senators. But Antony, such a turn of events would be favorable, as he would create a conflict in the Senate, drawing the attention of the Roman elites and allow to mediate in it. Something like this was being done by the real Roman emperors, so Antony had enough reasons to put this idea into practice. Thanks to this decision, Antony would not only get a more loyal Senate, but would also accelerate the integration of the elites of the East into the Roman system and significantly shift the center of gravity of politics towards the richer East. How much would all this have affected the vector of Rome's development? In a number of ways. Antony's Principate, characterized by a stronger republican component with more checks and balances, could have been a more stable system of power in times of peace, because it would have forced compromise to maintain power. But it would have been weakened in times of crisis by the need to cajole the Senate to approve even undoubtedly necessary actions, which could have had disastrous consequences. The most important challenge for Antony would have been to consolidate the regime itself, through legitimizing the system of transferring power to the princeps. Here, he would very likely have gone the way of Octavian, appointing one of his sons as his heir. The Senate would not have objected to this, as the idea of the Principate was by then already fully formed. The idea of having a strong leader was supported even by pro-Republican senators, as they realized that without a strong leader, capable in case of crisis to decisively stop any threat to the Republic, the state cannot survive. Antony, by the fact of winning the citizenship, would have the greatest authority in Rome, some of which would extend to his children. Few people could even compare to him in influence, and thus transferring power to his son would have been the only logical choice for both Antony and the Senate. Moreover, Such a transfer of power could be a guarantee of the continuation of Antony's policy and preservation of the current status quo, strictly tied to a set of mutual demands of the Senate and the princeps, concluded upon his accession to the throne. There was, however, one peculiar problem, whose name was Cleopatra. After the victory, Antony would have to break with the Queen of Egypt, as his open cohabitation with her would not accept for anything the Senate, and the Queen herself could not leave her country for a long time. But none of this would have been a significant problem. After all, Cleopatra herself was largely held together by Roman bayonets and would have accepted the rupture with dignity. But the flighty queen planted a pig, Caesarion. She hinted to everyone in direct text that the heir to the throne of Egypt was actually Caesar's own son, who should be the heir to his cause. And this posed a huge problem. In being lovers, Antony could turn a blind eye to the fantasies of Cleopatra, but becoming a princeps, he would have to solve the question of Caesarion. The presence of Caesar's heir was dangerous for the position of Antony himself, for the reason that he himself considered himself the heir to the cause of Caesar. No son of the Egyptian queen could not take away from him what he wrested in the bloody struggle. But the boy could be raised to the shield by Antony's enemies and set up a new war. In the Senate, the mere thought that some barbarian Egyptian will rule Rome caused indigestion, so the fate of Caesarion was predetermined. What in real history, in the event of Antony's victory, he was to retire from the historical scene out of the way. Having secured a legitimate transfer of power, Antony and his heirs would have subsequently followed a path similar to the real one, strengthening their own power, centralization, and Romanization of local elites. But this process would have been, in my opinion, softer and more inclusive due to the initially higher non-Roman component in the Senate. The greater limitation of the princeps' power, compared to reality, could also have been a deterrent to the self-rule of the emperors. But at the same time, after the departure from the historical arena of the generation that did not want a new war, it could lead to a new round of civil war, especially if on the throne would sit not the most successful ruler. And in the end, the system would still develop in the same direction as in reality, since there are no other options for ruling over such huge states with archaic means of communication.